This is History Myths and Myth Conceptions. And today's myth conception is Pygmalion. The myth of Pygmalion is hugely important. Like many myths, it deals with archetypes, which is why it's been reimagined in one form or another for centuries. From Jean-Jacques Rousseau's opera, where he likely coined or at least popularized the name Galatea, to George Bernard Shaw's play, which spawned a string of movie adaptations, including the musical My Fair Lady. And that's just the works that directly reference or adapt the ancient Greek myth. There are thousands of stories that reproduce the archetype in one way or another, like Frankenstein or pretty much any modern tale involving androids. The problem is that the original myth is often misunderstood and distorted. People think they know the story, but in reality they don't, or at best they know a fragment of it. For starters, we don't actually have many sources for this myth. Most people work from just one version, the most complete one we've got, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid, as you know, was a Roman author during the reign of Augustus. He's a primary source for a huge number of myths, and his versions are often brilliant. But obviously, quite often, we don't know how authentically Greek they are. Ovid used existing material, but naturally, he also made stuff up, because that's what everyone did. Greek and Roman mythology was essentially a shared universe, where different authors could take liberties and craft their own spins on the tales. So this version of Ovid is often misquoted and altered. And if you haven't read the original, you probably know only a watered-down fragment of the myth. In fact, what most people are familiar with is closer to the version of Pausanias. Pygmalion fell in love with the statue of a woman he had made, and Aphrodite brought the statue to life. Then, of course, they lived happily ever after. But this stripped-down version leaves out a few crucial layers of the story. Ovid connects various myths, and the story of Pygmalion doesn't actually begin with Pygmalion. It starts with a tale about the origins of prostitution. The daughters of Propetes, known as the Propytides, denied Aphrodite's divinity. As punishment, the goddess cursed them with a horrible curse. They lost any sense of shame. And that's how they became the first prostitutes ever. They also lost the ability to blush, and eventually they became so pale that they turned to stone. Pygmalion, disgusted by the Propytides and their behavior, lost all faith in women. Now, you can see there's much more depth to this story. First, Pygmalion's rejection of real women and obsession with creating an idealized statue didn't just come out of nowhere. Second, there's a recurring motif of the pale Propytides turning into statues, while Pygmalion, obviously, creates a statue of his own. Paintings often depict the statue as if it is made of stone, which contradicts pretty much every single bit of information on the myth. The statue is supposed to be made of ivory. Not from a single colossal piece, of course, but we can be pretty sure the myth refers to a chryselephantine statue. The most famous example of this technique is the lost Athena Parthenos, the monumental statue that once stood in the Parthenon. In this technique, the skin of the statue was made from ivory, while the clothes were crafted from gold. Ordinary statues were painted, but it's unlikely anyone would have considered painting an ivory statue. These statues were built around a wooden frame and were naturally modular in construction. Some modern retellings of the myth suggest that Pygmalion, in Ovid's version, fell in love with the statue and then Aphrodite brought it to life at his request. That's not quite right. In Metamorphoses, Pygmalion explicitly says he wants someone like his statue, not the statue itself. But Aphrodite knew what Pygmalion really meant. And now we come to modern interpretations of the myth, which often twist its meaning, or rather its meanings, since it's a multi-layered story. They twist in unusual and even obscene ways. Of course, myths, especially deep and complex ones with multiple contradictory versions, can be interpreted in countless ways. And because myths frequently deal with archetypes, it's easy to build an entire ivory tower of interpretations around a myth about an ivory statue. They are a near endless source of inspiration, which is why myths, like the story of Pygmalion, are constantly reimagined in new works of art. But there's a difference between interpreting a myth and making stuff up while pretending it's what the source material was meant to say. Let me give you a couple of modern examples. First, there's this interesting idea that the Pygmalion myth somehow refers to the practice of temple prostitution. That's highly unlikely. In Ovid's version, it's pretty clear that Aphrodite/Venus isn't endorsing this behavior. Prostitution was essentially born from her curse. Not to mention, invoking temple prostitution is often just a convenient way to sell books and market yourself as a provocative researcher. Most of the time, it's pure speculation. Anytime you hear those two magical words, temple prostitution, it's a good idea to approach the information with extra skepticism. Yes, you can make certain connections between the Pygmalion myth and temple prostitution, mainly by using our good friend Herodotus as a source. After all, Pygmalion lived on Cyprus, and Herodotus mentions the practice of sacred prostitution on the island. But I have to remind you that Herodotus also claimed that the semen of Indians is as black as their skin. He was full of fantastic tales about places he never visited. Another modern twist is the relentless quest to uncover traces of oppressive patriarchy in the Pygmalion myth. The theory goes something like this. Pygmalion wasn't satisfied with the role of women in sacred rituals, or he didn't want a real living partner, just control over a perfectly obedient, custom-made doll. The statue that comes to life supposedly lacks any quote-unquote agency of her own, and so on. It all sounds very deep and relevant today, but give it a couple of decades, it probably won't sound so deep or relevant anymore. Just like the analysis of the Pygmalion myth through the lens of class struggle and Lenin's teachings is neither deep nor relevant now.
Literal vampire pot-bellied goblins are hobbling round coming after us.
Pygmalion isn't some evil, power-hungry patriarch. He's, among other things, a lonely man who created an image of an ideal person, and his dream girl actually comes to life. It is much easier to interpret this myth as a romantic story and a story which tells us that, I don't know, an ideal of a good woman is better than, well, prostitutes or something. Ovid, by the way, was eventually exiled from Rome for writing rather lewd stuff in his The Art of Love, but that's a different story. Now, there's another potential layer to this myth. In The Golden Bough, his sprawling exploration of myth, religion, and magic, James George Frazer suggests that the transformation of the statue into a living woman mirrors the ritual marriage of the king of Cyprus to Aphrodite, or more specifically, to an image of Aphrodite, because the primary source for this theory seems to be a brief quote from Philostephanes of Cyrene, a writer from the 3rd century BC. According to Philostephanes, Pygmalion didn't just fall in love with any random ivory statue. It was a statue of Aphrodite. This could imply that the story is about a symbolic marriage, rather than, a literal one. It is a very interesting idea and an interesting piece of information. And it makes a lot of sense, especially when we consider that chryselephantine statues, those made from ivory and gold, were typically reserved for gods. However, we should tread carefully here. If this theory hinges mostly on a fragment from Philostephanes, we've got a problem. No works of Philostephanes survived. And the fragment in question comes from a work by Clement of Alexandria, a church father who supposedly lived in the 2nd century AD, which automatically means that we're dealing with a highly unreliable religious source. In fact, Clement's works only resurfaced in the 16th century, so we can't be certain who the actual author was. And if you're really critical of sources, you might even question whether Clement of Alexandria ever existed. But once again, it's an interesting additional layer to consider. Should I make a video game based on the myth of Pygmalion? Maybe. But for now, I've made a game based on the Theban cycle of Sophocles. So here comes a quick moment of shameless self-promotion. I've released a game called Oedipus/Antigone. It is a visual novel adaptation of Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. The link to the Steam page is in the description. If you'd like to support this channel, now you know how. Thank you.